Hey guys, Luke C here with the Firearm Blog with a supplement to my review of the recently released Franklin Armory BFS III 22C1 binary firing system. A lot of you out there will already be familiar with how a 1022 trigger is assembled and disassembled. However, there are several notable differences between the stock 1022 trigger and the 22C1 binary trigger. So in this video, I'll be showing you guys how to install the 22C1 system. To prepare for the installation, you'll first want to have a completely disassembled Ruger 1022 trigger housing. You'll want to keep all the OEM parts nearby, as you'll be needing a few of them to complete the installation of the 22C1. Franklin Armory recommends having a 1/16 inch Allen key, a 3/32 inch punch, a 5/32 punch, a 5/32 hex key, and a pair of needle nose pliers for installation. In addition to those tools, I'd also recommend having a magnetic parts tray, a flashlight or bright overhead lamp, as well as a pair of tweezers for the first part of the installation. Starting with the bare trigger housing, you'll first want to install the Selector detent. This is by far the most difficult portion of the installation and also runs the highest risk of you losing a vital part, so be extremely careful. You'll first want to make sure the trigger housing is clean and free of any oil or residue. Next, locate your selector and selector detent. The selector and selector detent go in the small hole located at the bottom of the trigger housing. It's here that I use the tweezers in lieu of the needle nose pliers that Franklin recommends. I find it much easier to fit the tweezers in the cramped space. Once the selector, detent, and spring are seated in the hole, you'll then want to locate your selector and punch. While depressing the selector detent, you want to slide the selector in from the right-hand side of the trigger housing with the flat portion of the selector pointed towards the detent. The flat portion of the selector is there to aid in seating the selector inside the trigger housing as it rides up against the detent. Once the selector is seated, you'll want to move it in between each of the three positions to check its function. Next, we'll install the trigger assembly. For this, you'll need the Franklin Armory supplied trigger assembly, the OEM trigger pin and OEM trigger spring, and the plunger. Once you've seated the trigger, spring, and plunger, you'll want to insert the trigger assembly from the top of the trigger housing while simultaneously compressing the trigger, spring, and plunger. With the back of the trigger holding the plunger and spring in place, you'll need to line up the hole for the OEM trigger pin with the slave pin and push the OEM trigger through to the other side. This is naturally going to dislodge the slave pin, which I also recommend keeping around just in case you ever have to disassemble the trigger, as it'll keep it all together and provide for a much better reinstallation. Moving on to the hammer installation, you'll want to locate the hammer, hammer spring, spacers, hammer pin, and bolt catch spring. Install the hammer spring with the square end on the rear of the hammer, then install the spacers on either side. Finally, you'll want to place the bolt lock spring on the right-hand side of the hammer, making sure to have the dog leg portion of the spring facing down and with the straight leg pointing up. Line up the assembly with the corresponding hole and push the hammer pin all the way through. It's here you'll want to make sure that both of the legs of the hammer spring fall into the recesses on either side of the trigger roll pin. You can use a pair of tweezers or punch or really anything else to make sure you can get both of the legs of the hammer spring into the recesses on either side of the trigger. Next, we'll need the bolt lock, OEM magazine latch pivot pin, and the magazine plunger and its spring. First, reinsert the magazine plunger and spring back into the trigger guard assembly housing, pushing it back far enough so that the OEM magazine latch fits behind the plunger and is held in place by it. Next, you want to line up and install the magazine latch pivot pin, making sure it goes through the magazine latch and the bolt lock. Next, you'll want to get the OEM ejector and ejector pivot pin and install both of those. When you install the ejector, it helps to install the pivot pin from the left-hand side, leaving enough room on the right-hand side so that you can seat the straight leg of the bolt lock spring under the pivot pin. Now you're ready to insert your completed BFS III 22C1 back into your 1022. You'll first need to ensure both selector levers have been removed from the selector rod. Next, you'll want to install the completed trigger guard assembly into your receiver and reinsert the completed receiver and trigger guard back into your stock. Make sure to tighten down your takedown screw before proceeding to the next step. Once the takedown screw is tightened, you can finally reattach both selector levers, making sure to line up the grooves on each side and then tightening them down with the supplied 1/16 inch hex key. After this, you should closely follow the dry fire checklist Franklin includes with the trigger to check for function. That'll do it for today's installation guide. I appreciate you guys watching. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and we'll see you next time.